So, in the same way as Trump is claiming that he's negotiating with China over tariffs, and then China says there hasn't been any negotiations, I wouldn't view any of the announcements that Trump has made or Steve Witkoff has made about the progress of the negotiations as anything other than empty sort of real estate salesman talk. This is just plain.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder back on the show. He's spoken to us about this meeting, those iconic photos between Donald Trump and President Zelensky over the weekend at Pope Francis's funeral. So what he thinks that they got out of that, basically how we can end the war, and those comments from Donald Trump, who's kind of now coming to the idea that perhaps Putin doesn't want to end the war. Perhaps he's been stringing him along all this time. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. So Bill Browder, thank you again for joining the Trump Report. So much has happened over the weekend at Pope Francis's funeral. We saw so many world leaders meeting for the first time in a while after a tumultuous few months when it's come to this, trying to get a deal done between various different countries. But one of the big takeaways in the last few days is Donald Trump saying that he's very disappointed in Russia for continuing their strikes against Ukraine. He's urged for Putin to sit down and sign a deal. What's your response to this, Bill? Because it kind of it's kind of like has Donald Trump had his head in the sand the last few months as strikes have been ongoing.
Well, there were a lot of people writing very celebratory headlines and articles this weekend saying that Donald Trump has changed his position. He's now questioning Putin. Is Putin playing him? All this type of stuff. I wouldn't celebrate too much, because at the end of the day, what matters are not these words, but what matters are the actions. And so far, we have not seen the United States or Donald Trump take any hard punitive actions against Putin. All the punitive actions have been taken against Ukraine, not against Russia. And so I will be celebrating if there's any punitive actions taken by the United States against Vladimir Putin. Up until that moment, I view all this as just sort of background noise.
And we know that Donald Trump's administration had urged him against calling Vladimir Putin. They basically said there's no reason for you to be speaking on the phone again until Putin shows that he's ready to broker a ceasefire or broker a peace deal. But the Kremlin did meet with Steve Witkoff late last week to discuss these negotiations to end the war. Trump said that they are very close to a deal on a ceasefire. This is before when they went to the Vatican, and that the two countries should finally meet to finish it off. But you've been hesitant in, shining a positive light on any of these discussions, Bill, because you understand that it does feel a bit wish-washy. Are you still understanding that the Kremlin and Steve Witkoff's meetings haven't really actually ended up with any sort of result?
Well, so in the same way as Trump is claiming that he's negotiating with China over tariffs, and then China says there hasn't been any negotiations, I wouldn't view any of the announcements that Trump has made or Steve Witkoff has made about the progress of the negotiations as anything other than empty sort of real estate salesman talk. This is just plain that they're doing, and I wouldn't put any faith in that whatsoever. At the end of the day, what we know is that Putin hasn't in any way adjusted his expectations about what he wants from this war. He wants for Ukraine to capitulate. He's not offered anything of any great substance as a compromise. And at the same time, the United States up until now has been demanding from Ukraine what Putin has been demanding from Ukraine, which is to give up territory into perpetuity, to not join NATO, and to basically no longer receive military aid from the West. And so I don't see anything that has changed materially, because Putin is the aggressor. Putin is the person who needs to be pressured, not Ukraine. And the United States hasn't put any pressure on Putin.
In response to that meeting between Steve Witkoff, Bill, and members of the Kremlin, Trump spoke and said that basically all major points were agreed on between Russia and the United States. But we have to acknowledge, yet again, Ukraine was not present for this meeting. So why are we going around in roundabouts with these meetings between Russia and the United States when Ukraine is still not present?
Well, I think that that's a question for Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio. It's not really a question for me. I don't have any idea why what this is even. I mean, it's all a load of nonsense in my mind. There are two warring parties. They both have very extreme positions. The Russian position is they want to succeed in their invasion. The Ukrainian position is that they want the invading country to withdraw. Everything else is effectively noise, as far as I'm concerned. And the only way to resolve this conflict is militarily, one of two ways. Either the Ukrainians end up with a military advantage, and then Russia is forced, and I should say forced, to come to the table, because at the moment they're not forced, or vice versa. But at the moment, neither side has a decisive military advantage. And neither side Ukraine doesn't want to give up its sovereignty, and Russia doesn't want to give up its sort of war of aggression to win in Ukraine. And it's sort of naive and almost infantile to show up with all this real estate jargon in a major diplomatic negotiation that involves losses of hundreds of thousands of lives.
Bill, we're entering Donald Trump's first 100 days of his administration tomorrow, and we know that he campaigned on the fact that he said that he could end the war between Russia and Ukraine in his first 24 hours. He went back on those comments and said he was being sarcastic, but he did really campaign on the fact that he would be the guy to end this war. Now, when you're looking at these first 100 days of his administration, how are you viewing this situation? Are you viewing it as in Donald Trump did actually fulfill this promise in the sense that he got discussions on the table, or do you think he's not really lived up to the potential that he could have?
Well, he made a ridiculous promise that was totally unfulfillable. There was no way that this war could end in 24 hours. There's no way that this war could end in 100 days. The war is a complicated issue based on a fascist dictator, Vladimir Putin, that needs to be put under the most extreme pressure possible to stop his invasion. He's the one invading. The Ukrainians aren't the ones doing the invasion. They're the ones defending. And for him to force them to surrender is just crazy. And that's what he's done. So all he's done is threatened to cut off U.S. military aid to Ukraine in exchange to try to force them to surrender. And then he's getting frustrated that they don't want to surrender and that their European allies and British allies and Canadian allies don't want them to surrender either. And so that's the only bone of contention here.
Over the weekend, Donald Trump, he made a pretty startling remark, startling to us just having watched the way he's interacted with Russia and Putin and the way he's spoken to Zelensky. But he wrote on Truth Social, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions. Too many people are dying. Now, Bill, obviously this is something that you've been front and center of the past 3 years, trying to advocate for Ukraine, and acknowledging that you believe, and that so many of us believe, that Putin has been playing games with Donald Trump in the last 3 months. When you see this comment of Donald Trump saying publicly he now believes that Putin is just tapping him along, what is your response to that?
Well, so let me be really generous. I'm going to be really generous, Donald Trump. Every president since George Bush who've had to deal with Vladimir Putin, thought that they could use the power of their personality and of their charisma to convince him to be well behaved. And George Bush started this whole process in a meeting in Slovenia when they first met. And he said, I looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul and thought he was a reasonable man. And then it became clear, and Putin was able to take advantage of that for a few months until it became clear he wasn't a reasonable man, and the relationship between the United States and Russia broke down. Then Obama shows up, this bright, charismatic young man. He shows up and he says, "I want to have a reset with Russia." And he even physically presented a red reset button via his Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And again, the reset lasted for a few months, and then he realized that Putin was just a hardened criminal that couldn't be dealt with. And then Trump comes in his first term and says he has a good relationship and wants a good relationship with Russia. And nothing particularly good happened, but nothing particularly bad happened either. Then Biden comes in and he says, "I want to have a predictable relationship with Russia." And of course, Putin starts the war. And so in the most charitable terms, we can say that Trump is just doing what everyone else has done before. But that's the most charitable way we can describe the fact that he was sort of hoping that his charisma would win Putin over, and then he makes this comment. I'm not necessarily in my own mind feeling that the answer is in the most charitable terms. There's obviously something else going on because of the way he's behaved towards Ukraine and the way he's behaved towards Russia. But hopefully, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we can be charitable, think that he's made the mistake that everyone else has made, and now he's come around. But I would suspect that over the next days and weeks, we'll see more of the same. The berating of Ukraine and the lack of consequences for Putin as this conversation continues.
And that's what so many experts have warned, or I guess not warned, but I said is the only silver lining, Bill, is that Donald Trump's unpredictability means that he could swing back in favor of Zelensky and Ukraine. But again, then he swings back to Russia. So it's really hard to keep up. But over the weekend, we saw that pretty iconic photo released of President Zelensky and President Donald Trump having a one-on-one discussion in the Vatican. What was your reaction when you saw those two discussing the war? I mean, they both said that the discussions went very well, but how far can it really go?
Well, I mean, we were really on the precipice of a disaster leading up into the weekend. Secretary of State Marco Rubio basically said if Ukraine doesn't capitulate, then the U.S. is going to cut off all aid to Ukraine and basically wash its hands of Ukraine. And of course, that would have been really catastrophic in terms of loss of life in Ukraine. Ukraine would have been able to carry on, but a lot more people would have died. And so the fact that there was this meeting, this image, these two heads of state meeting, and then this slight thawing of the U.S. position is, of course, extremely heartening to me and anyone else who cares about Ukraine. But it's impossible to predict what is going to happen next because it's just so arbitrary. The only thing that isn't arbitrary is that there have been no consequences against Putin, and until there's consequences, if America were to use the power that it has to provide more arms for Ukraine, to provide punishing sanctions against Russia and secondary sanctions against those who purchase Russian oil, then Putin would probably come to the table. Then he would probably agree to terms that would be acceptable to Ukraine. But that hasn't happened, and so far Trump has not made any indication that that's going to happen.
But Bill, in the last month, Donald Trump, he was threatening more sanctions. He was threatening more sanctions on Russia. He was threatening sanctions and tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. So what's it going to take for him to actually implement these?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the answer is that he's going to do it if he wants to do it, and he's not going to do it if he doesn't want to do it. And we don't know what's really driving him because his behavior has been contrary to the public interests of America. Americans don't like Putin; they like Zelensky. Contrary to historical Republican foreign policy positions, and contrary to the interests of America, Europe, and all freedom-loving countries.
Bill, just finally on this situation, when it comes to a full-on proposed ceasefire from the US to Russia, it would see Ukraine having to officially give up Crimea, which they obviously lost in 2014 to Russia. And it would see that 20% of land that Russia's occupied from Ukraine officially given to Russia and seen as Russian territory. Now, this is one of the more concerning parts of a peace deal from Ukrainians, and Zelensky, who's rejected that proposal, he's basically like, no, I'm not giving up any land. I'm never going to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, nor are we going to recognize that 20% as Russian territory. But he's also acknowledged that he doesn't believe that Ukraine would be able to regain that territory with Ukrainian weapons alone. So they would need the help of, we would assume, the United States. Do you believe Trump when he says that Zelensky is warming to the idea of giving up this land?
I do not. I don't think that he's going to, that under any circumstances, Ukraine is going to formally recognize occupied parts of Ukraine as Russian territory, nor will Europe, nor will the UK. I think the best scenario and the only reasonable scenario would be some type of scenario where everybody drops their weapons, that the territory is not recognized as Russian territory, and that the West, including the United States, then protects Ukraine from any further invasion, and that hopefully someday down the road that territory can be negotiated back through diplomacy instead of war back to Ukraine. That's, I think, the only position that Ukraine could possibly accept, but they're not going to ever accept that they've given up their territory. And nor should we, because then we've just rewarded Putin for taking over a country by an act of aggression and getting what he wants.
But it also goes to show, Bill, that, you know, as we've kind of acknowledged in the last few weeks, especially with the Signal leak chat, how inexperienced Trump's cabinet must be advising him to go ahead with this kind of ceasefire proposal, because anyone could tell you that if Ukraine gives up that amount of land, they're not ending the war, because it just lets Russia seep into the country and occupy the Ukraine more than it already was.
That's exactly right. And furthermore, if Russia succeeds in getting what they want in Ukraine, that they don't stop their war. They then move on to other countries, and specifically, they move on to the Baltics or Poland. These are countries, particularly the Baltics, that Putin has said publicly shouldn't be independent countries. They should be part of Russia. And so it's very dangerous for Europe and for everybody else just to have this whole scenario playing itself out, where people are suggesting that, you know, Putin, that sanctions get lifted against Russia, that they get awarded this territory. And so what do? Putin then licks his wounds, rearms with all the new money that's coming in, and then has another go. And the war is not over, the threat is not over, and we're all in a much worse place.
Or wait, it just waits the next 3 years until, you know, Trump's term's up and does the exact same dance that he's been doing he did under the Biden administration. So we'll be watching to see if any developments happen this week, Bill, as they always do. So thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.